Introduction, Paul is passing stuff out, and so you're actually going to learn how to collaborate with different agencies. This year, Erin and I and Gabe from YWCA met with Paul and created a great relationship where we came to him and said, we have a problem. And he said, we never knew it was a problem. And so we were able to have a collaboration and work together to make a change in our law that is best for both of us and brings both of us clarity to a law that helps victims. And so y'all know me, I'm Alex. I'm gonna let Paul introduce himself and then we'll get started.
Paul Smith, I am the Executive Director of the Rental Housing Association. So we represent the landlords and property managers, rental housing operators in the state of Utah.
Perfect, you're going next.
Okay, so I'm not sure exactly what you want to hear from me today. So hopefully, whether you're online or whether you're in this room, you'll ask some questions. You'll make this interactive. I just want to tell you about 12, 13 years ago, we were at a conference nationally where we were talking about domestic violence issues. And I said, we really need to run legislation in Utah that clarifies that landlords need to release victims of domestic violence from their lease. And so we did that. We worked with Ned Searle with the state and got what I thought was a great piece of legislation. And I thought it was working because I didn't hear anything about it for 13, 14 years. And then last fall, we were approached and asked to make some tweaks, which we were willing to make. We also were able to, at the same time, make it a little more clear for our landlords and operators. So if you see this slide, excuse me, we already had a piece of legislation that required landlords to release victims of domestic violence with a 45-day lease equivalent or rent equivalent cancellation fee, okay? However, it did say in order to access the privilege of lease release, you had to be current on all your obligations and 100% in compliance with your lease. We understand now that that's a little limiting, and so we made some tweaks that I think will be very helpful. Yeah.
Got you ready.
Thank you.
Here's more water, guys.
Do you want me to do this? Okay, the second slide says that here's what we changed. The first thing that we did is we allowed additional triggers. The only trigger, the only two things that you could use to get out of a lease were a protective order or a police report indicating the victim or the tenant was a victim of domestic violence. We added some additional paperwork. Do you want to get into specifically what we added? Because you understand that?
Yeah.
They'll get into that a little bit later. The second thing is we reduced the fee from 45 days down to 30. And we thought that was fair. But what we also did is that we said the tenant has to release the unit at least 15 days prior. So they give 30 days notice. They have to be out within 15 days. So the landlord has at least 15 days to what we call turnover or get the apartment ready for a new customer. Does that make sense? Next, we added that renters who are not in compliance with the lease, and it was in the last 30 days, if it was caused by the domestic violence, we would still let them out of the lease. So let me give you a couple examples. Prior to this change, you had to be paid up on rent to request domestic violence lease release. Now you can say, the reason it can't be more than 30 days behind, but the reason I'm behind is because of the abuse, the perpetrator's in charge of the funds or whatever, and they're not paying to punish me or whatever. So now if you can provide some documentation, or in my opinion, documentation means an attestation that you're out of compliance because of something related to domestic violence, you'll be released from the lease. The other scenario is, let's say there was a police incident. Well, if that was caused by domestic violence, that's a violation of your lease, but we're still gonna let you access lease release privileges. Are there any questions so far? Is the microphone not close enough? Okay, I'm sorry. Okay,
So this was in the law previously, but I always want to highlight it because how many times do us advocates forget something's in the law? All the time. Please, I'm speaking for myself. So victims are able still to get new homes. So they're a victim of domestic violence, say the perpetrator didn't live with them, they can easily change their locks. And it also requires that the landlord not give out new keys to the perpetrator. And that the victim, but the victim does have to pay for the new locks. And so understanding that this is an option is good, but realize you may need to access our other nonprofits like Fight Domestic Violence or Crime Victims Reparations Emergency Fund or their reparation fund to get this service done if the expense of locks is out of their realm of expenses. Okay, so what is DV lease termination law? This is the code. So if any of you have had my trainings before, what am I going to say? I'm going to say, go home, print this law, read it, and put it in your binder of the laws you need to know. Because if we don't know the law as advocates, you are not doing a job for your victims. So know the law, because otherwise you're failing your clients, and I will say that. The thing that we want to talk about is, so this is code 5722 5.1, and it deals with multiple issues. We're focused on domestic violence, victims' rights to terminate the rental agreement and allows victim survivors who meet the criteria, right? Just what we're talking about. So why did this law need to be changed? Obviously, Paul and his group were amazing to even think about bringing this law to us years ago, before any of us did. And that's been a great help, but we've reached some barriers. There was not a whole lot of clarity in the law. When does the victim need to get out? When can they get out? And so we did a survey through the University of Utah, and we surveyed 182 people or organizations. People who work for organizations, both victim service providers, housing advocates, and attorneys, and asked, what issues are you seeing? Like, what issues do you see with this law? Because prior to that, Aaron and I and Gabe, who's not here, had people coming up to us saying, this law isn't working, we need it fixed. We had no way of saying why. We could give evidence. I could tell you stories of why it didn't work, but we didn't have the data to say these are the issues within our community. But the survey gave us a lot of that information. You're good? Okay, so we have three main requirements that were made using this law that were difficult for victims. The only option for proof was a cohabitant abuse protective order or a police report. And it also said that the victim had to not be, like, could not, basically didn't add to the violence. I can't remember the language now. And we changed that language to be non-predominant aggressor. We also had perfect lease compliance and 45 days rent. And it also was unclear, do they get out the day they give the landlord the 45 days rent, or do they finish out that month? Was that 45 days of rent and then you get out at the end of 45 days? We didn't know. None of us knew. They didn't know. We all just did the best we could. And so that was part of the barrier too. So we've kind of talked about this. I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but Gabe at YWCA made this beautiful graphic, and I wanted to show it just to show you kind of the different groups of people that we're looking at, possible concerns or barriers. Again, as Alex said, then we went to the U and had graduate students who were willing to help us with the research piece. Representative Judkins ended up being the sponsor of the bill. She had a lot of experience working with Paul and the association that he's with, and so she knew that we could have some really productive conversations together about any adjustments that needed to be made. We worked really hard to make this a consensus bill. We wanted to make sure that we weren't up there arguing about the nuances of what needed to be changed and not need to be changed with legislators, because as you know, and has become clearer and clearer, this is pretty complex, and everyone's
situation in their rental is different, and in their, obviously, in their domestic violence situation is different. And so trying to really do all of that work ahead of time, so that by the time we brought this bill to its first legislative committee, we could say we're all in agreement and we could all stand behind it. And so we were really fortunate to have a great group of people around the table to do that, facilitated by Representative Jenkins. And now we're kind of at that stage of letting you all know about it. One of the things that we heard most frequently in the surveys was the very #1 reason that people had difficulty with the law is that they didn't know it existed. So whether or not anything changed, we knew that we needed to get out here, come to SWAVO, give this information in our different conferences, get the information on websites and out to victim advocates everywhere we could. We don't expect victims of crime to know the statute and know that this exists. We do expect, as Alex was saying, us as victim advocates and those working with survivors every day to know about it. And so regardless of what happened with this bill, we wanted to get the word out more and make sure that people knew this existed. A lot of people had been using it, but what we heard really clearly from the survey was, we don't even know what you're talking about. We weren't using it. So I think from whatever perspective you're on, whether you were using it a lot or whether you've never heard of it, we knew we needed to do more awareness. So what did the legislature do? I kind of already went through the process. I was out of town when they did the bill submitting. I was very upset about it. But this was the lovely bill submitting that we had. And as you can see, Alex and Paul were there. Representative Jenkins in the middle. And then Gabe, and then my boss got to meet me in that event. She sucks. Just kidding. She's great. And so HB 13 unanimously passed at every single vote. I think you all know how rare that is. And so we're really happy about that. And then it did go into effect. So the key changes, and we're all going to kind of talk about different pieces of these, but I'll start us off. We've already talked about these, both Paul and Alex have said it broadly. I'm just going to get into more specifics and make sure you don't all have questions. Alex is actually going to go more into the chart, where the chart's the next one, about the different protective orders, the bazillion protective orders that you all heard about this morning. We were able to add most of those. Again, Paul mentioned that, and Alex did as well, that I think back in 2010, there were probably many fewer protective order options for people. And so this was not a point of contention. The folks who operate rentals and landlords were really supportive of the fact that, yeah, we intended for protective orders to be a way to make sure that someone really is a victim. And again, that's not to say that anyone's individually doubting that someone's in an abusive situation, but these are legal contracts that landlords have with tenants. And so we need to make sure that there was some kind of court order saying that, yes, this was a real situation and this person is experiencing abuse. So it added 4 additional protective orders, civil and criminal, and then civil and criminal stalking injunctions, which were not in there. Ex parte civil orders are not eligible to be used as your proof. Again, if you have these proof, it's all moot. But if you don't, we want to make sure protective orders were an option. But not ex parte, because again, we wanted to make sure that it was far enough along the process that there had been a hearing and that a judge or commissioner had said this order is legit. And then Alex mentioned this, but the previous law said that the victim could not have participated in the violence. I think we all know that these situations can get really messy, and that victims can sometimes be seen as being violent in self-defense or for other reasons. And so again, we want to tie this to what's in the law, and the law is about being predominant aggressor, and that should be indicated in police reports anyway. And so again, making sure that matches with the way that we're doing that work, and that that's what we're saying. You cannot be listed as the victim or as the perpetrator in the police report.
Okay, so previously the DV Lease termination law, the only protective order that was applicable was the cohabitant abuse protective order on this list. These are our protective orders, both criminal and civil. And everyone knows what an ex parte order is, correct? Nod your head yes, ex parte. So it's the one where the victim goes and says, give me an order, and the judge says, yeah, your paper looks good, let's have a hearing, right? It's that first initial order that is not enough to use to terminate your lease. You have to get past that hearing where a judge says, yes, you get your permanent protective. When it comes to criminal protective orders, obviously there's the criminal case and then the judge enters a protective order, so you don't have an ex parte criminal protective order. It's just going to be a protective order. And those both work. You just have to remember, a victim can't go request a protective order on Monday, the judge signs it at 4 o'clock, and then they go terminate their lease that day. It doesn't work. There has to be some safety planning to blend the time of when that protective order is filed and when the permanent is entered. Yes, Vicky, let me get you the mic.
So under the criminal protective orders, a jail release protective order would have count, right?
Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure.
You're the best. The police report would work, but a jail release agreement doesn't. Okay, so those are the agreements police are sending right at the initial stage, right? Those do not qualify for lease termination, but that whole incident of why you got the jail release agreement is there was a police report. And if your victim is in that police report is not the prominent aggressor, that works. Okay. Next, I flip my slides. You're next.
All right. So let's talk about this fee. Why is there a fee? Well, landlords are also victims of domestic violence, right? They're not the primary victim. We're not equating or saying that they're equivalent victims, but when someone cancels a lease, there sometimes are damages. And so rather than calculate the actual damages, which sometimes can be higher, very rarely can be lower, sometimes in law, we set a specific fee. So why take it down from 45 to 30? Because we now have clarity that the tenant has to be out at least 15 days prior to the end of the term. So for instance, Alex and I were talking about this when I first got here. Some of the confusion was we would have victims give 45 days notice, pay a 45-day fee and stay 44 days. And so the landlord would finally get that place back and still have 2 weeks of work. And they didn't feel like that was fair. So in exchange for having more clarity and extra time, it was more than fair to reduce it from 45 down to 40. Is there anything else you want to say?
You want to say?
I was just gonna say, introduce yourself. Oh, yeah. But it goes, by the way, my name is Gavin. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Rental Housing Association. I just wanted to clarify here on this point, for the flexibility and non-compliance issues is on this slide as well. So in the previous law, the 2010 law, we've talked about it a little bit redundantly, but I think it's worth going over. It required perfect compliance with the lease agreement. Just to clarify this procedure, that if you are in violation of the lease agreement, there still is an avenue for a victim to be out, but that violation has to be related to 2 things. One, it has to be within 30 days of this notice that's being provided to the landlord. And then second is that the violation has to be related to domestic violence or due to the domestic violence incident. So I'm going to recover while we're still on the slide.
And I would just want to remind you, many landlords will work above and beyond the law. The law is just a minimal requirement. And so we encourage you as advocates to reach out to the landlords and say, can you do a better deal? Is there something else you can do? Even if they don't comply, is there a way you can help them? Many landlords want to help. And I will also volunteer if you're having specific issues with any landlord in our state, and we have 315,000 rental units, reach out to us. We will call that landlord and try to mediate or explain or help them find a better resolution for you, if that makes sense. Okay. Now, one thing I will say is we had many situations where there was a violation, either rent wasn't paid or there was a criminal act, and landlords had started an eviction process. And technically, now most of them would still work with the victim, but technically, They could have said, we don't have to release a victim once we've started an eviction. Now, even if an eviction has been started, we can remove the victim's name from that lawsuit. We can release them from any future obligation. The only thing you still need to understand is there's no release for past violations or past liability. For instance, if the landlord moved them in and there was all new carpet and all new paint, and when they move out eventually, there's going to be damages. Getting off the lease does not absolve your victims of responsibility for that damage. It just absolves them of future rent obligations.
And we kind of talked about this 15 days, and I also want, like, as we're right here, let's like take a minute and think how grateful we are as advocates to have developed this relationship and to blend this so that you guys understand everything from their perspective. Because I can sit up here and quote the law to you, but I can't tell you how it works from a landlord. And to build this relationship and to build this contact is great for all of us. And I think this goes towards the importance of us collaborating with our partners in all fields in the system. So again, we're talking about this, clarifies that the victim will vacate the property within 15 days. But previously this statute was silent. And so all of these changes allow survivors better access to the law, but we'll need to work with the landlords. Like Paul was saying, is the landlords can make this easier and do a better deal. But we're doing a minimum here, right? We're saying this is the minimum that has to be done. And if, just like we blended this relationship and created a new law, you could do that with those landlords. Call them, talk to them, create that relationship so that they know you're not there to like harm them, but you're there to help their tenant and your victim. Standardized form, we got Aaron next.
Most of you are probably aware of this unless you weren't aware of the law in general. Utah Legal Services has a standardized form that's been there. I don't know if it's been there since 2010, but then they've been providing this resource for you all. Because I don't know how to do QR codes, you just have the little, give you the directions for getting to it on their website. They have updated it. I do want to make one clarification. So you don't have to use this form, but I think it's an easy thing to use for working with tenants to just have it be a really clear standardized notice. Again, not required, but I think it's a good resource from them. One thing I wanted to just really clearly state is that box in the middle that says non-payment of rental charges incurred within past 30 days. They're suggesting that the victim can mark, I state the reason for non-payment within the past 30 days was due to domestic violence. That's what we've been talking about with the non-compliance. I just want to be really clear that yes, they need to mark that if they're just needing to access the law, but they still owe that 30 days of rent, and that fee that they're paying is not the same as back rent that they owe. Again, I think some landlords will be happy to work with that person and say, pay me the 30-day termination fee that pays you up on any past rent owed for the last month. But technically, as the law states, all we're saying is that if they haven't paid their rent, they still owe it, but they still get to access this protection in this statute. So I just want to make sure that's clear. We're going to ask them to just make that clear on the form as well, but I just want to make sure you all understand that. And again, bare minimum, I think landlords who are used to using this law and who are willing to work with you and the victims you're working with, I think will give some flexibility around that, but that is what the law says. Some really quick tips. Oh, I wanted to mention in the Google Drive for today's training, we also have just like a one pager on this. You're welcome to link that on your websites or have those available in your offices. We want to give something that's much simpler than this PowerPoint. And then we also have a similar document that the Rental Housing Association created. So kind of from here's what they're telling landlords to do with this new updated law, and then one for you about how to use it. So we encourage you to pull that off the website or off the Google Drive that Rochelle shared, and spread the word on this for sure. On that document, you'll see some of these tips. One of the things that has come up a lot that we've heard from service providers is that you will not often see this victim until they've been gone. they left the unit, they, whether or not the perpetrator is still there, depends on the situation, they haven't been paying, they haven't told their landlord, they're kind of in deep by the time they see you, so to speak. They can still access the law, all of the same requirements apply. Again, they need to be paid up, they need to go back and pay any owed rent. Again, that damages that may have been caused by the domestic violence, they're not kind of off the hook for the costs of that, but it's not too late. They can still access the law, but they need to communicate with that landlord, and I think that's where you can really help them. You want to make sure they don't give the notice though until they're really able to move out within that timeline, now that that's more clear. So I wanted to make sure to mention that. Again, the safety planning piece, we're going to talk about different scenarios, but you might have someone who's just in their own unit, they're not on the lease with the perpetrator, but maybe it's an ex-perpetrator and suddenly they figured out where that person lives and they just need to get out of there and be in a confidential place. You all know this, I don't need to tell you, but just keeping in mind that this is a minimum way to offer some protection and some ways to get out of a lease, but it's not the same as all the other safety planning pieces that you'll need to be doing with that person. And again, if they're living with roommates and the perpetrator, if they're living with roommates without the perpetrator, we're gonna go through some of those, but making sure that that safety planning is part of your practice for them. And then just, I talked about the timing, and then just, Alex always reminded me of this, making sure you're documenting. It could all go very smoothly. That landlord is great to work with. They're out of their lease, everything's fine. And then 2 years later, they find themselves on, as Paul was indicating, some kind of an eviction process, and they really shouldn't be. So, but they need to have that documentation. Don't depend on the landlord only to have that documentation, making sure that they have that. And that you're reminding them that they need to keep that stuff for as long as they can.
Hey, I want to tell you one other law change this, well, it's 2 years ago that I'm really proud of, that might help you help your victims. We now have an eviction expungement process in the state. So if you have a client that you're helping, and they're having a problem finding decent housing because of an eviction record or something like that, we can now get that expunged. All they need to do is pay off the balance and petition the court. And after 60 days, unless the landlord objects, and we haven't seen any landlords object to any of these so far, it's expunged. It's like it never happened. So we hope that helps eliminate barriers to quality housing for your clients and victims. And just wanted to make sure you were aware of it. So if the victim breaks the lease agreement, all other parties are still responsible. Now, we talk about 4 scenarios of domestic violence lease release. The first is if a victim is the sole person on the lease, that's the cleanest type of break, because they come to you or they come to the landlord, they say, look, I'm being abused, I need to move. Great, turn over the keys, leave it clean, and we can probably rent it the very next day if we're lucky, right? That unfortunately is not always the case. The most common is that both the victim and the perpetrator share that lease, right? In that case, what we are going to have to do is release the victim, but we cannot terminate the agreement with the perpetrator without going through an eviction. So if you will help us and make sure the landlord knows there's a police report, we can do the eviction with a police report. We may not be able to do an eviction with just a protective order. Does that make sense? A protective order is not a lease violation where a criminal act on the property being cited by law enforcement is a clear violation of the lease. So in that case where the victim is going to be released and the perpetrator is going to stay, it's really important, as Alex says, to document that, because whether we like it or not, rental properties, apartment communities change hands. And 2 years from now, if accidentally they forgot to take that victim's name off the collection, we're gonna need some proof to get them off the collection at that point, okay? Then there's a couple other scenarios. Sometimes there's multiple people on a lease, and including the victim and the perpetrator, and that gets a little messy. But the point here is communicate. If you have questions, call Alex, call me. We will work you through these things, help you work through it with the landlord.
How do you advocate for that?
Oh, the best way to advocate with landlords is not treat them like dirt, okay? Now, believe it or not, there are many people that have conflict with another party and they treat the other party like dirt. And you're not gonna get very far that way. So the first thing that you wanna do is respect that they run a business. They're not a greedy corporation. We have 100,000 of our 315,000 rentals in Utah, 100,000 single family homes. Many of them owned by seniors and that's their income, or many of them owned by families and that's how they pay their kids' college tuition. So don't assume that they're a greedy, money-grubbing, mean, awful, horrible person. Treat them with respect and you're more likely to get respect in return. Second, if they're not working with you, if they're not getting it, and believe me, I understand, I talk to landlords all day long, and sometimes they don't get it. Call me, and it's my job then to help them get it, to help them understand their obligations under the law, and why in many cases, it's better to get domestic violence away from their property, and not, we obviously don't want to punish the victim, but we just want to put it behind us. It is disruptive, not only to the victim, it's disruptive to the neighbors, it's disruptive and sometimes damaging to the property. It's drama for the apartment manager or the landlord. So these are things that we want to make sure landlords understand. The easier you can get through and past this, the better.
Okay, and so, whoa, I got real loud there. Okay, next we are gonna talk about a case example. And I want your all's input. I will shove a mic in your face if you don't want to talk, Okay. Angela's monthly rent is $1,100 and her lease buyout is $3,000. She still has 6 months on her lease. She wants to know if she qualifies for the DD lease termination statute. That's all you know. So what do you need to ask and how can you help? Bueller. Anyone? Come on, guys. What would the first question be? Okay.
Has there been a domestic violence incident?
You're a genius. Okay, so you want to ask, has there been domestic violence? Have the police been called? Have you applied for a protective order? Are you planning on applying for a protective order? Are you somewhere safe? Are you still in the house with your perpetrator? Are you both on the lease? And who's your landlord? Let's start this conversation. Let's call your landlord today and say, hey. So the answer is yes, they got beat by so-and-so. And like, here's my landlord, and landlord's call. Okay, let's call him together and say, hey, here's my situation. I do have a police report. Maybe I'm anticipating doing the DD lease termination, but I'm trying to figure out how to get the 30 days rent. I just want to let you know this is coming. How would that landlord feel if there's that communication? They would be so much more likely to work with, and so much more likely to be like, okay, let's do this. Let's figure out how to get you safe. Right? Do you have any points about it?
I'm just gonna add, I can't underemphasize how important your guys' help in communicating with landlords is. As you're aware, a victim of domestic violence is gonna have trauma. You guys are gonna be able to communicate in a trauma-informed way, in a way that's gonna articulate to the landlord a very accurate situation, what's going on. That's easier to digest and understand. When coming from a victim, a lot of victims can advocate for themselves, but sometimes it's just not communicated in a particularly effective way. And so I would just encourage you, as you're thinking really early on in this process and you're looking at this timeline, hey, here's the steps. I would look for opportunities. Hey, how can I help the communication process with the landlord? And whether that's involving us at the rental housing association, or using your resources, your involvement in that communication can make a world of difference.
And let me remind you, the typical response to conflict is fight or flight, right? Do you know what the most common response from a tenant is? Freeze, or bury your head in the sand, or avoid it, or not communicate. And I just have to remind you, don't assume that they're talking to their landlord. You know, ask if you can talk to the landlord on their behalf, because even if they're talking to the landlord, as Gavin said, they might have so much trauma that they're not doing a good job explaining what's going on and asking the landlord for help. So you guys need to get involved and be involved in that process.
Thank you. And again, we kind of like this slide as possible lease situations for Angela. And a lot of this kind of goes through like Angela provides landlord information demonstrating eligibility for this lease termination. She gives written notice, she gives the 30 days rent, and then she must be out within 15 days if she's the only one on the lease. Again, we talked about this earlier, but if she's the co-leaser, co-tenant, there we go. I don't speak landlord clearly.
You're doing great.
I'm trying, right? But if she's the co-tenant, then we talked about how if the landlord knows there's a police report, it's easier for them to evict the perpetrator. But that still doesn't disqualify her or Angela from getting out of that lease and basically wiping her name off of it, right? And then Angela is on the lease with a roommate, but not with her abusive partner. How does that work? Oh.
Listen, as we've said many times, there's multiple victims in domestic violence, and her roommate is going to be a victim here because we're going to have to release Angela from her lease obligation. And what that means is the roommate who moved in thinking that she was only going to have to pay half of the rent, she either has to now find a new roommate, or she has to pay the whole rent, or she has to negotiate with the landlord to also be released at the same time. Now, my recommendation to you, if you ever deal with a situation like this, is ask to be released at the same time. Now, there's no requirement that the landlord release them both, but it makes so much sense. And if I could talk to the landlord and I can say, look, if you don't release the roommate in 2 months, you're going to have an eviction because she's not going to be able to pay. It's so much better for you to get this behind you and move on. So that's how I would handle it.
And then our next scenario to get these experts' advice is both Angela and her abusive partner are on a lease with a roommate. What happens then? Yeah.
Like Paul said, there's multiple victims, right, with domestic violence there, or at least there's potential for multiple victims. In this situation, any leaseholder that's not a victim of domestic violence as a direct victim isn't going to be able to get off that lease agreement. However, here's where it does get nice in the communication part, is the landlord could pursue an eviction against that tenant that was the abuser. The other possibility, I would say, for tenants that were, let's say these roommates that were remaining in a situation along those lines, is they themselves could try to seek, obviously their physical well-being is taken care of, but also changing the law to some of those other situations and avenues that the law provides is available in here. But again, making sure that the victim that's advocating this notice is, again, their safety is going to be primary responsibility number one.
The only thing I would add is, again, talk to the landlord, talk to me, say, look, there's no winners here. Let's get this behind us in the best way possible. And if that means letting the whole lease out rather than punishing the two non-perpetrator, non-victim roommates, so be it.
So again, I think we are learning over and over again that how important these relationships are. I think so often us as advocates, kind of sit in our little box and we feel the walls caving in on us because it feels like the system's fighting us. But we need to break down those walls and create those relationships and realize that we can do more than just advocate to our victim. We can help our victim advocate to other systems that aren't just police and the courts. So next we're going to talk about case management resources to assist survivors. So we have Utah Community Action. We've got Community CAP Utah is like the website. And mind you, I don't know these resources very well, so you should know them better than I do. But we also have the domestic violence shelter programs statewide will help victims as well. And Erin is going to add more.
I just want to say, Alex mentioned Fight Against Domestic Violence. They're a really great resource. We reached out to them. They will often help pay these termination fees for victims. The Home Safe program that UBC operates, which is on your slide, is also a great option for that. Unfortunately, we get so many requests when we open the form each month, that it often closes the same day. But the only way to get financial resources for those victims is through you as an advocate. You apply for that and get them on the waiting list for those resources. So again, that's an option for paying that termination fee. We heard over and over again that the termination fee was kind of number 2 behind, we don't even know this law exists. The next barrier was 30 days rent can be a lot for this person. And so really our nonprofits and some of these resources end up being the ones paying those fees. So make sure you know what those options are. Again, the landlord tenant mediation that Utah Community Action offers, I think, is a really great resource and really effective. Again, as Paul's mentioned, maybe even knocking down that fee a little bit if they know the person can't pay it, and just helping them get even more resources for that. But I wanted to specifically mention Home Safe. I know that's general fund money. We're going to be trying to get more of it. It's one of the few options in the state for just cash assistance to victims if they're working with an advocate and can demonstrate. Obviously, it's a pretty easy demonstration, but demonstrate that they have a need, and it's specifically around housing, preventing homelessness. So definitely use that.
I just wanted to add kind of to this, and this is more generic and general information, but I think it applies. I spent a number of years of doing low-income tenant advocacy. It's something that we routinely found is that tenants that are more connected with their communities not only enjoy their rentals more and have a more effective and happier lifestyle within their rentals, but they tend to, when they have situations, whether it be domestic violence or financial hardship or other types of things, can get themselves out of those situations more effectively and have quicker turnarounds on these things. And so again, it's more generic than this, but I think you as advocates for victims of domestic violence, you should spend, and obviously you're here, you're doing it, but spend as much time as you can networking and building community relationships. When people ask for help, these are great resources. Obviously you're here, these are great resources you can use, but I can't tell you the number of religious organizations that reach out and say, hey, we want to help people that are going through hard times, bishops, pastors, priests. It's just all across the board, rabbis that want to help. Oftentimes too, moving can be difficult, finding furniture, actually moving your physical belongings. And again, those same types of local organizations, local YMCA groups, local religious organizations, local chapters of societies in various ways. So I would encourage any tenant. I think it's important in our society to be connected and to grow our networks, especially given the changes that we've seen, not only in the pandemic, but the technology, but particularly if you're going through a hard time, especially something like domestic violence, it really helps with the isolation and these other different angles and different pieces that can be affected. And so you yourselves, I would encourage you to really get connected and the victims you're working with to be connected.
When we deal with the eviction issues in Utah, almost the vast majority of people who get evicted are people who don't ask for help, right? And so low income and sometimes traumatized renters don't ask for help. It's your job to help them create a list. Who are the 5 people we can ask for help in your sphere? You know, your family, your neighbors, your church, your community groups. You'd be surprised how many of them will, no questions asked, help people, but only if they ask.
Thank you. Okay, so the next thing is we have some legal advocacy resources. Before we talk about these, I have a question, and I'm gonna make you raise your dang hands for this. Online, I will pretend to raise your hands. Skip online a little bit longer. I know, okay. I guess give online some time. How many of you think you need an attorney to help a victim terminate their lease? Raise your hand. Maybe. One. Okay. There's some people raising hands online. Okay, the reality is if you don't. That is why I asked this. This sounds like legal jargon because it is legal jargon. And again, I'm getting on my soapbox. If you don't know the law as an advocate, you are doing harm to your client. This is a law you need to know. And you can use this law as a non-attorney. You can take this law and help a victim understand it and take these steps. You don't have to depend on these 4 legal clinics that are bursting at the seams. You can do this as an advocate. If you run into issues, you now know Paul and Gavin. You can reach out to them and say, hey, you came to the Rocky Mountain area racetrack and were willing to speak to us. Help me, I'm stuck, right? Like they're here to help us. And this is something you can do. And I think as advocates, sometimes we get told, oh, you're not an attorney, you can't. No, you are an advocate, you're powerful and you have a ground to stand on, and you can do a whole lot more than you think you can. So know this law, read this law, and use it, and use the connections. You know how to allies in this field to help you get leases terminated so that landlords are kept as whole as possible and victims are safe.
And I would even add, call us first. Sometimes they'll get involved and screw it all up. So call us first. Remember what they say about attorneys. Attorneys are like nuclear weapons. We have them because the other side has them. But if either side uses them, everything gets totally messed up, right?
I agree with that.
I'm just gonna name the elephant in the room, which is all of your eye rolls that I saw when Paul said, treat landlords with respect, they're good people too. You all have dealt with some really crappy landlords, that's what I'm gonna say out loud, sorry. They hear from only landlords who are working with the law and asking questions. They don't hear from you all or from the landlords who are causing issues, because they're not gonna call Paul and say, just so you know, I'm causing these issues, could you help me not cause some issues? They're not gonna call him and say that. We need you to get to reach out for their help. And so when we sat around a conference table, it was the first time I'd ever met Paul, and he said, your advocates can call us if you're having problems with these landlords. We don't know who they are. We hear from the landlords who are using this law. You keep telling us these aren't being used, but who are these people? Those aren't the landlords we know as well. And I felt like, well, we don't even have to run a bill. Just that could probably solve a lot of your problems. Paul might really regret saying that you are his new, that he is your new resource. So I just think if Paul can hear about these issues and the association can hear about these issues directly, I think it will not only help you resolve them, I think it will help us continue the conversation about, like, are there other barriers or roadblocks we're seeing? Because if only the victim advocates are hearing it and they're not hearing it, we're never gonna be able to come together on some of these changes. So I saw some of your faces when he was talking about all the good landlords in the state, and I know that you dealt with ones who aren't as good, and so let us and them help you. I know it's frustrating.
And as we build this connection between these our organizations and build these bridges, we're going to be able to create new policies, new protocols, new relationships to deal with bigger issues. Next steps. Okay, next steps. This is a new law from our survey. Most y'all didn't even know this law existed. So now the 100+ of you that are listening to me can't think that called out anymore. So you know about it. I want you to print the law. We said we gave you a 1-pager from us, a 1-pager from them, or their white page, how landlords do it. Have that in your book. Remember I said, print the law, know the law, make a book of all your resources. These are things that you're going to print. I doubt you all do that, but I'm telling you, you should. And I want you to share this message. If there's agencies that need training about domestic violence lease termination, reach out to Gabe and I and Erin. And we will get to your agency, we will create trainings. We're wanting to do an online version of this, so it can just be shared. So please spread the word, because the only way we're gonna help victims is if we know the law that gives us power to advocate for them. And, yeah.
I recommend, I kind of skipped this part earlier with the domestic violence shelter resources. Relatively new, quote unquote, thing is that shelter organizations have been able to get funding to have housing case managers. So if you've never worked with someone and suddenly this is coming up, or housing is coming up for folks, reach out to that organization, or reach out to Liz and Marie at our office. She might even be online today. She is. And she's a great resource for connecting you to those folks. She also runs a specific housing for victim advocates meeting, group training every month. She'll be delving into some of this as well, but she'll be a great resource to connect you with folks who are specifically doing housing case management for victims at TV organizations, and then also connecting to some of those legal organizations and the CAP organizations also have. The community action programs also have housing case managers that conduct domestic violence. So do you all have, in our last 2 seconds, additional trainings that you already know happen that you think we need to get this information out to, things that you think are helpful for implementation or just feedback in general? You can also, what do you think?
I was gonna say, if y'all don't want to say something, email us. If you have ideas of where we could do this presentation, email us, we'd be happy to. Again, take a picture of this. Paul said, I asked if I could get it in writing, he can be a resource to our service providers, and he said yes. So it's up there, and Gavin will send out his email as well. And then question? I'm checking on over.
I just wanted to know, so I know this is for termination of lease, but how does this work for victims who get evicted for domestic violence and the nuisance from the domestic violence?
Alex run.
Coming back.
So let me make sure I understand. This law protects. This law requires lease release if it's happening right now. But if it's happened 2 years ago, what are the resources available to victims? Is that what you're kind of asking?
And they were evicted.
They were evicted, there's an eviction record?
Under the previous law.
Okay. So, just like Alex said, just because there's a law in place doesn't mean people know about it and use it at the right time. So, if you've got a past case, bring it to me and we'll brainstorm. And maybe we can settle. Most of the attorneys, Utah's a state that has what I call, and you're gonna roll your eyes too, a firm but fair eviction process. But what it does is it requires, if you're a tenant and you violate a lease, and after been given a notice, you force a landlord to go to court, it penalizes you. It's called treble damages. And so oftentimes in an eviction, you might have a $6,000 judgment. It was actually only $2,000 in damage, and they tripled it as a penalty for forcing them to use the legal system. So you can come to us and we can say, maybe we can get them to reduce the damages from 6,000 down to 2,000. Maybe if there is a case that the victim never should have been included in the victim or in the eviction at all, we can get, I can't remember the fancy legal term, but we can have them removed from the collection. So I can't give you a wholesale do this in all cases answer, but I can say if you have specific issues, reach out and Gavin and I will try to help you find solutions.
Perfect. I think in addition to that, it might be a little anecdotal. So a law firm I worked with out of state, about 2 years ago, I worked with this firm, but we had a tenant that was being evicted for a domestic violence situation. It violated the lease agreement's crime-free release provision. Now, this is out of state, so it's different laws. That's exactly what this new law addresses. And so like Paul had mentioned in part of it with the non-compliance, the previous law, 2010 law, would have still allowed that type of provision within a lease agreement to say, hey, no, we're gonna proceed, that's a violation of the lease agreement, and by there being a violation, you can't access the lease, get out of the lease part. This new law, just to clarify, I don't know if you talked about it, but it opens that door for that tenant specifically. This new law, it allows for they're in violation of the lease agreement, but and you're being evicted for that violation. But that violation was because of domestic violence and was in the past 30 days. Both have to be satisfied. It's a conjunctive requirement, not disjunctive. But if that conjunctive requirement is satisfied, then they could be let off. And the landlord in that situation has the ability to remove and segregate the tenant that's evicting out of the eviction and proceed with just the remaining parties on the lease. So that's exactly why we like this new law. It addresses your very concerns, in addition to the things that we and Paul can help with.
You remember what I said about attorneys? We never would have heard the word conjunctive or disjunctive if we hadn't had an attorney here, so.
I turned to Aaron and said, he's an attorney.
I just wanted to also mention, Paul mentioned the eviction piece, eviction expungement piece that passed 2 years ago to make expungements of evictions easier. That's huge. I actually wrote myself a note that we should add it to our web pager. And I think that that is probably one of your answers. When we started working with Representative Jenkins and then met with the association, one of our first questions was, by far, what you all are seeing the most is the evictions already done. Like they didn't know about, like we said, you didn't know about the law, or they couldn't afford the termination fee, the eviction's done. Now what do we do? It's too late. And so I think one of the things we asked Representative Jenkins and the folks we were working with in the association and the attorneys that were there was, is there anything we can do to make the expungements of those evictions easier, specifically for DV victims? And we kind of walked through what passed 2 years ago and decided that avenue's already there, that this would really help victims. And so thank you for reminding me, we need to add that to our training and add it to our resources.
I'm coming for you.
So I'm going to make this. So, okay, can you hear me? So I have a special population of survivors that I work with, and some of the issues I'm coming up with, and I apologize, I was out of the hearing on how to work out. So I work with survivors whose offenders are getting out of the world, and so we're talking years. And some of them are still living in the same place where the abusing offense. And they're not being able to get out of their leases. Do they qualify for this? If not, how do I help them? And one of the other things I wanted to bring on too is I have been advising, can we put a ring camera on from your apartment, and landlords are saying no, but these are things that we can keep them safe. And so I'm working with the tail end. These offenders are going to, and they'll have a full agreement stating, hey, you know what, you can't have contact with this victim, whether there's a protective order in place or not. And so I just wondered how I can navigate that.
Did you hear that? Okay, I think so. Okay, so DD works with the victims whose offenders are getting out of prison and not able to have a lease, and then also have issues with them.
The first thing I would say about ring cameras, if you are having landlords that don't want those installed, I get it. Sometimes we're worried about damage to our property. But by and large, ring cameras have an upside. So call me, I'll call that landlord and talk them into it. Okay? So the next thing that I would say about Gavin only had a conversation. I don't know. Believe me, you guys think I'm gonna get a lot of calls. I never get calls. I sit there and wait for calls, but nobody calls me at a desk. Gavin and I were talking on the way out. How old would a situation have to be to qualify? And both of us agree the law is silent. And so if you had a police report 3 years ago and you brought it to us today, we'd have to release you from the lease. Okay, so that might help in these populations where it was years ago, if there was protective order, if there was a police report, then we should be able to get them out of the lease.
And I think that also goes, you've got this unique population, you can call them and say, hey, I've got this case. Blah, 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 happened, he's getting out of prison, they now are ready to move, they didn't think about moving before. Now they're scared and wanna move, I'm sure with the collaboration with them, they're gonna help figure out a way to move. Okay,
Here's what I'm gonna say to the landlord. I'm gonna say in 30 days, a threat to your physical property is being released from prison. Do you wanna roll the dice, or do you wanna let this person out of the lease? Okay, and I'll be very persuasive.
okay, so conclusions of today's presentation, building bridges is amazing. And we have connections. This law is going to change your victims' lives. If you, I'm going to say, know the law, use the law, utilize the law. Okay, you guys are gonna be sick of me hearing me saying that, but I believe it with all my heart and soul. Are there any other questions, or should we call up any questions online? Did we miss anyone? Okay, thank you online, folks. We missed you in person. Okay,
Question.
oh, coming to you.
So my question has to do with one thing the Paul said that, it's a little bit disturbing to me when he says that, think the landlord like is exclusive. And I can understand that you're talking that, it's the whole group, but we know that a lot of them, there are big corporations and whatnot, especially like complexes and all that kind of stuff. And, when it comes to financial responsibility, even the fact that we're pointing that it will be the cost of the tenant to change a lot, that's kind of disturbing to me. I don't know why. I mean, we're thinking about the money that they made, as a whole. But anyway, my question has to do with actually people that are going through a housing discrimination case. And at the same time, they're part of a EV case. Let's say that they start the process of, filing discrimination case with the state. And on top of that, for a reason, the pressure, the landlord, family unit, whatever. I mean, are there any provisions or any support in those type of cases? Because we were listening before that we don't need an attorney in order to, start the process. But since the complexity is getting into both sides, one with the landlord for domestic violence, and the other one where the tenant is putting that claim against the landlord. I mean, do you have any answer to that?
Coming back to you, Gavin, you looked excited.
No, you're, if I understand your question, how do we handle the complexity of a fair housing complaint that's also happening in the midst of a domestic violence situation? I have an attorney answer for you. They're different processes. We can operate them individually. So if you have one, they shouldn't interrupt with each other. In addition, fair housing is going to prevent retaliation against a tenant for submitting a fair housing complaint. So the answer is they shouldn't really impact each other. Now, they might emotionally impact things, particularly for a tenant, right? That's going through an ambiguous domestic violence. I also feel like I'm being discriminated against. So then the emotional turmoil is actually probably, and not probably, it's very much so more complicated than the actual legal turmoil. There shouldn't be any crossing hairs there. You should still be able to exercise your fair housing rights in addition to your domestic violence rights and exercise this law, despite the fact that an investigation is ongoing. Does that help? Yeah.
Well, in terms of legal, support.
Oh, like what you can help with.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for support, call me. I'll get involved.
Yeah, I said, I mean, as far as advocates for yourself, right, advising on fair housing is gonna be, let's do that, like real practicality, you as the advisors. There is a line between what you can do legally versus, hey, what you can't do legally. I want to view them as being crossed. And wherever your line is on a fair housing issue, keep that line. It doesn't adjust because there's domestic violence, and whatever that line is on a domestic violence issue, which It sounds like we want it to be pretty far. We want to be able to do quite a bit when it helps getting someone relief that's a victim. That doesn't adjust either because there's a fair housing. Just don't cross. Don't, hey, let me talk to you about what I can help with this. Oh, fair housing comes in, switch paths. I mean, that's my attorney advice to you. That would be, hey, just don't cross those lines, but that makes sense.
I think the best thing is like keep them independent, I think is what you're saying, is really make sure that you as the advocate, you're saying, I'm sorry, fair housing is going on. That's not my expertise, but I can do this lane, and so let's walk down this lane together. Okay, any other questions, concerns?
Michelle's about to pop, because
Okay, we're out of time. Solution is better call. Call.
That's what we should do.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll just have a quick